The snow fell upon Ravenscroft Hall like a burial shroud, soft and relentless, muffling the world beyond the frosted windows, while inside the great ballroom blazed with the false warmth of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled guests, who laughed and whispered and moved through the elaborate figures of a country dance, as though nothing in the world could ever touch them, as though no grave had ever been dug in winter soil, as though no man had ever died alone in a prison cell, crying out for justice that would never come. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the edge of this glittering scene, wearing the modest dove-grey silk of her assumed station, her fingers pressed against the small glass vial hidden within her left glove, feeling its weight like a promise kept too long. She had called herself Ellen Ashford for 6 months now, had smiled and curtsied, and effaced herself in the shadow of Lady Whitmore, had learned the rhythms of this world that had once been her own before the old Duke of Ravenscroft had whispered poison into the ears of powerful men and sent her father to his death. 5 years she had waited for this night, 5 years of cold rooms and colder rage, of teaching other people's children their letters while she practiced a different kind of alphabet in her heart, one that spelled only vengeance. The ballroom doors swept open once more, and she felt rather than saw him enter, the current Duke, Frederick Ravenscroft. Tall and dark-haired, and carrying himself with a weariness that seemed at odds with a man of 32 hosting his own Christmas celebration. She had studied him from afar for months, had memorized the schedule of his movements, had learned that he took wine alone in his library each night at midnight, a habit that would make her task almost elegant in its simplicity. Yet seeing him now in the flesh, close enough to observe the particular way the candlelight caught the sharp planes of his face, close enough to note the shadows beneath his eyes and the perfunctory nature of his smile as he greeted each guest, she felt something shift uncomfortably beneath her breastbone. He looked tired. He looked haunted. He looked, she thought with sudden vicious clarity, nothing at all like a monster. But monsters rarely did. Her mother had taught her that before the consumption took her, before Eleanor was left truly alone in the world. Beside the Duke stood Lady Harriet Sinclair, his widowed cousin, elegant in deep green velvet, and beyond them both Eleanor caught sight of another face, one that sent ice threading through her veins. Lord Thomas Greville stood near the card-room entrance, his pale eyes scanning the crowd with predatory patience, and for one terrible moment those eyes found hers and lingered there with something like recognition. Eleanor turned away, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hand tightening around the vial. Outside the windows the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the crowd a woman laughed about being stranded until morning, about what a delicious adventure it would be. Eleanor touched the cameo at her throat, her mother's cameo, and moved deeper into the ballroom toward the private refreshment alcove where, in just 4 hours, she would finally set her father free. She had not intended to be seen, not yet, not until the moment when seeing would no longer matter, but fate had other designs, and they arrived in the form of the Duke himself materializing at her elbow as she stood in the shadowed alcove near the refreshment table, his voice low and touched with wry amusement as he said, "I do not believe we have been introduced, and yet you seem to be studying my wine collection with remarkable intensity." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face and then rush back in a burning wave as she turned to face him, closer now than she had ever been, close enough to see that his eyes were not the cold iron grey she had imagined, but something warmer, something almost gentle, touched with flecks of amber that caught the candlelight like hidden fire. She executed a curtsy that she prayed did not betray the trembling in her knees, murmuring, "I beg your pardon. Your Grace, I am Miss Ellen Ashford, companion to Lady Whitmore. I merely sought a moment of quiet away from the crowd." Frederick tilted his head, studying her with an attention that felt like being slowly unwrapped, and she found herself acutely aware of the vial pressed against her palm, of the cameo at her throat, of every breath that moved between them in the warm air, heavy with the scent of pine boughs and mulled wine. "You have the look," he said quietly, "of someone attending a funeral rather than a Christmas ball. And I confess I find that infinitely more interesting than any conversation I have had this evening." The words should have sounded cruel, but his tone held only curiosity and something else, something that might have been recognition, as though he too understood what it meant to stand in a room full of merriment while carrying grief like stones in one's pockets. Eleanor forced a smile that felt like cracking porcelain. "It is only that Christmas reminds me of those no longer with us. Your Grace, I did not mean to appear melancholy." He nodded slowly, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, a shadow passing over features that she realized with uncomfortable clarity were not merely handsome, but beautiful in the way of weathered cliffs and winter storms, carved by some private suffering she had never thought to consider. "Christmas is indeed a time for ghosts," he said, "and for redemption, if we are fortunate enough to deserve it. But I suspect, Miss Ashford, that you are owed far more redemption than you seek." Before she could pass the strange weight of his words, he had bowed over her hand, the touch of his fingers through her glove sending an unwelcome shock along her spine, and extracted a promise that she would save him, a dance before the evening ended. He had barely disappeared into the crowd when another figure materialized from the shadows, Lord Greville, his smile thin as a blade edge as he said, "What a charming picture you made with His Grace, Miss Ashford. One might almost think you belonged among such elevated company." And his pale eyes lingered on her face with an intensity that told her he saw something there, something familiar, something that made her hand tighten involuntarily around the vial as the snow outside fell harder and the roads disappeared beneath white silence. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. She fled through corridors she did not know, past servants who barely glanced at the grey-clad companion, hurrying with her head bowed, past doorways that spilled golden light and the sound of laughter that seemed to mock the thundering of her heart, and all the while Lord Greville's pale eyes followed her in memory, his words echoing like the tolling of a funeral bell as he had leaned close and murmured, "How very much you remind me of someone, Miss Ashford. A gentleman I once knew, a gentleman who met an unfortunate end." And she had seen in his thin smile the shape of a threat that went far deeper than mere suspicion. Her father's face rose before her unbidden, not as she had last seen him through the bars of his cell, gaunt and broken, and still proclaiming his innocence. To ears that refused to hear, but as he had been before, laughing in their garden on a summer afternoon, lifting her onto his shoulders so she could pick apples from the highest branches, calling her his little Eleanor, his pride, his heart. The memory struck her like a physical blow, and she stumbled, catching herself against a doorframe, and only then did she realize where her desperate flight had carried her. The library stretched before her, vast and silent, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes that gleamed in the light of a fire burning low in the grate, and there at the far end stood a massive mahogany desk covered with papers and letters, and a single wineglass waiting empty beside a crystal decanter. She should not be here. She knew this with the same certainty that she knew her own name, her true name, the one she had buried beneath layers of grief and rage. But her feet carried her forward nonetheless, drawn by something she could not name, and her eyes fell upon the papers scattered across the desk surface with their familiar handwriting, their damning words. The letter on top was half finished, addressed to someone called Sir Benjamin Chalfont, and as Eleanor's gaze moved across the lines, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet, like ice cracking on a winter pond. I have found further evidence of my uncle's conspiracy against the treacherous Ashworth family, the Duke had written in a bold, clear hand, and I am more convinced than ever that Lord Greville played a central role in fabricating the treason charges that destroyed an innocent man. I must find the daughter before Greville does. She deserves to know the truth. She deserves justice. The paper trembled in Eleanor's hands, and she realized she had picked it up without conscious thought, was holding it now like a lifeline or perhaps like a death sentence, because everything she had believed, everything that had sustained her through 5 years of cold rooms and colder purpose, was crumbling to ash around her. Footsteps sounded in the corridor beyond, and she thrust the letter back onto the desk, her heart seizing with terror. But the steps passed by and faded into silence, leaving her alone with the ruins of her certainty and the wine-glass gleaming in the firelight, like a question she no longer knew how to answer. She stood in the corridor outside the library for what felt like hours, though the clock had barely moved, her back pressed against the cold wall and her mind a tempest of confusion that matched the storm howling beyond the windows, and in her gloved hand the vial seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own, demanding she remember why she had come, demanding she honor the memory of a father who had died with her name on his lips and innocence in his broken heart. But the words on that letter burned behind her eyes. I must find the daughter before Greville does. She deserves to know the truth. She deserves justice. And Eleanor found herself questioning everything she had believed with such iron certainty for 5 long years of grief and careful planning. Could it be possible that she had been wrong? Could the current Duke of Ravenscroft truly be innocent of his uncle's sins, not merely inheriting the title, but actively working to undo the damage that title had wrought? Her father's face swam before her again, and this time she saw not his suffering, but his wisdom, the way he had always taught her to seek truth before judgment, to weigh evidence before condemnation. And she heard his voice as clearly as if he stood beside her, saying, Eleanor, my darling, vengeance built on false foundations destroys the one who wields it. The vial grew heavy in her palm, and she pressed her hand against her thigh, feeling its small, deadly weight through the silk of her gown, and she knew with sudden, terrible clarity that she could not proceed until she understood the full truth of what had happened to her family and who truly bore the guilt. Lord Greville's pale eyes flickered through her memory, his insinuating words, his threatening smile, and she recalled now what her grief-stricken mind had refused to examine before, that Greville had been present at her father's trial, that Greville had testified against him with such smooth conviction, that Greville had been the one to suggest the evidence that sealed her father's fate. The corridor seemed to tilt beneath her feet as pieces of a puzzle she had never thought to question began rearranging themselves into a new and horrifying pattern, and somewhere in the distant ballroom a clock chimed the hour. 10 o'clock, 2 hours until midnight. 2 hours until the Duke would retreat to his library with his wine and his ghosts. She straightened her spine and drew a breath that steadied her trembling hands. And when she moved, it was not toward the servants' stairs and escape, but back toward the golden light and swirling music of the ballroom, because Eleanor Ashworth had not survived 5 years of poverty and grief and burning purpose only to strike blindly at a target that might prove to be the wrong man entirely. She would watch, she would listen, she would learn. And when midnight came, she would know with certainty whether the Duke deserved her poison or her confession. And God help them both when that hour finally arrived. The music swelled as Eleanor re-entered the ballroom, a waltz beginning its sweeping 3/4 time, and she had barely found her footing among the glittering crowd when she felt him before she saw him, a presence at her shoulder that sent warmth flooding through her, despite every warning her mind could muster. And then his voice came low and pleased. "Miss Ashford, I had begun to fear you had abandoned us to the storm." And she turned to find Frederick Ravenscroft standing before her with something like relief softening the serious lines of his face, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I found myself in need of air, Your Grace," she managed, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue, but he merely smiled and extended his gloved hand toward her with a question in his gaze, and she knew she should refuse, knew that every moment in his presence made her mission more impossible. Yet her fingers were already settling into his palm, as if they belonged there, as if 5 years of hatred could be undone by a single touch. The waltz carried them into the swirl of dancers, and Eleanor became acutely aware of his hand at her waist, firm and warm through the layers of her gown, of his height that required her to tilt her chin upward to meet his eyes, of the vial pressing against her palm inside her glove, like an accusation she could no longer answer with certainty. "You dance beautifully," he said, guiding her through a turn with effortless grace. "But there is sadness in your eyes that even candlelight cannot disguise," and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed walls tremble at his perception, at the gentleness with which he spoke of her pain, as though it mattered to him. "Christmas Eve has always been a time of ghosts for me," she admitted before she could stop herself, speaking more truth than she had intended. And Frederick nodded slowly, his thumb tracing an unconscious pattern against her waist that sent shivers cascading down her spine. "For me as well," he said quietly. "Each year at midnight I retreat to my library alone, to remember those I have lost and those I have failed." And his voice carried such genuine weight of sorrow that Eleanor felt her heart crack along fault lines she had not known existed. The snow fell heavy beyond the tall windows, romantic and treacherous in equal measure, and from across the ballroom she could feel Lord Greville's calculating gaze following their movements like a predator tracking wounded prey. But in this moment there was only Frederick's steady presence, his warmth, his unexpected confession of vulnerability that matched her own hidden grief. "You speak of failure, Your Grace," she heard herself say. "But what failures could a man of your position possibly carry?" And the smile that crossed his features held no joy, only the bitter acknowledgement of truths too heavy for a ballroom, and when he answered his words would echo in her memory long after the music faded, saying softly, "The failures we inherit can wound as deeply as those we create ourselves, Miss Ashford, and redemption is a path I walk daily without knowing if I shall ever reach its end." The waltz ended, and Eleanor felt the loss of Frederick's steadying presence like a physical ache as he released her hand with visible reluctance, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment longer than propriety allowed, before a servant appeared at his elbow with whispered urgency about a matter requiring the Duke's attention, and she watched him go, with her heart thundering against her ribs and the vial in her glove feeling heavier than it had any right to feel. A weight of death she no longer knew if she could deliver. She stood alone at the edge of the dance floor, flushed and trembling, when a gentle hand touched her arm, and she turned to find Lady Harriet Sinclair regarding her with knowing eyes that held none of the judgment Eleanor expected, only a warmth that seemed almost maternal, despite the woman being perhaps only 10 years her senior, and before Eleanor could compose herself. Harriet was guiding her toward a quiet alcove away from the swirling dancers and curious gazes. "You look as though you have seen a ghost." "Miss Ashford," Harriet said softly, settling them both onto a velvet settee half hidden by heavy damask curtains. "Or perhaps as though you are one yourself." And Eleanor's breath caught at the perception in those words, at the way this elegant widow seemed to see straight through her careful disguise to the haunted creature beneath. "Forgive me," Eleanor managed. "I find myself overwhelmed by the evening's events," and Harriet's smile was gentle, but her eyes remained sharp as she replied, "My cousin has that effect on people, though usually not in quite the way he seems to have affected you," and something in her tone made Eleanor wonder just how much Lady Harriet understood about the currents flowing beneath this glittering surface. "There is something I must tell you," Harriet continued, her voice dropping lower still until Eleanor had to lean close to, hear above the distant music, about Lord Greville, and at that name Eleanor felt ice cascade down her spine, even as she fought to keep her expression neutral. "He is not what he appears," Harriet said, her gloved fingers tightening on Eleanor's arm. "He was my late uncle's closest confidant, and I have reason to believe he was complicit in terrible things. Things Frederick has spent 3 years trying to expose," and Eleanor's world tilted again as another piece of the puzzle she had thought complete revealed itself to be entirely wrong. "Frederick carries guilt that is not his to bear," Harriet continued with quiet intensity. "He inherited not just a title, but a legacy of cruelty he has sworn to undo, and there is one family in particular whose destruction haunts him. A man falsely accused of treason, a daughter left orphaned and lost," and Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes as she heard her own tragedy described by someone who could not know she was speaking to that very daughter, that very orphan, that very ghost of Ravenscroft's sins. The snow continued falling beyond the windows as guests began retiring to hastily prepared rooms, and somewhere in the distance Lord Greville's pale eyes searched the thinning crowd, and Eleanor sat frozen in the alcove, with Lady Harriet's words echoing through her shattered certainty, knowing that midnight approached, and with it a reckoning she could no longer predict. The great clock in the entrance hall began its measured journey toward midnight, and Eleanor stood alone beside a frost-traced window, watching the storm rage beyond the glass, while inside her chest a tempest equally fierce threatened to tear her apart. For everything she had believed for 5 years now lay in ruins at her feet, and yet the pain of her father's death remained as sharp as ever, a wound that demanded justice even as the face of justice shifted and blurred before her eyes. Her left hand found the vial through her glove, that small glass vessel she had carried like a talisman of vengeance, and she pressed her fingers against it, feeling its familiar shape, while her mind replayed every word Lady Harriet had spoken, every letter she had glimpsed on Frederick's desk, every gentle word the Duke himself had offered during their dance, and she thought of her father's face the last time she had seen him, gaunt and hollow-eyed in that terrible prison, still proclaiming his innocence even as the life drained from him. The ballroom had grown quieter now as stranded guests retreated to hastily prepared chambers, their voices fading to distant murmurs, and through the thinning crowd Eleanor watched Frederick move among his remaining visitors with a weariness that seemed to age him beyond his 32 years, his dark eyes finding hers across the candle-lit space with a look that sent warmth flooding through her veins, even as her fingers tightened on the instrument of his intended death. Midnight approached with the inevitability of a tide, and Eleanor knew she must make her choice, knew that the library awaited with its crackling fire and the wine-glass Frederick would fill for his solitary ritual of remembrance, and she found herself drifting toward the corridor that led to that fateful room while her heart screamed contradictions she could not reconcile. For how could she murder a man who might be innocent, and yet how could she abandon her father's memory to the void of unanswered grief? The vial seemed to pulse against her palm like a second heartbeat as she paused in the shadowed hallway, and she thought of all the nights she had lain awake planning this moment, all the mornings she had risen with vengeance as her only reason to continue breathing, and she understood with sudden terrible clarity that she had become a creature of hatred, that the girl her father had loved had died alongside him in that cold prison cell. Lady Harriet's concerned gaze followed her from across the room, and somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors, Lord Greville moved with his own dark purposes, and the storm outside reached its crescendo with thunder rolling through the ancient stones of Ravenscroft Hall, and Eleanor Ashworth, who had entered this house as an assassin, found herself walking toward the library with a different intention burning in her breast, not to poison, but to demand the truth, to look into Frederick's eyes and ask him directly about the Ashworth name, about her father, about whether redemption was truly the path he walked, or merely a pretty fiction for a guilty conscience, and whatever answer he gave would determine whether the vial in her glove would find its purpose or be cast into the fire forever. The library door yielded silently beneath Eleanor's trembling fingers as the great clock in the distant hall began its sonorous declaration of midnight, each chime rolling through the corridors of Ravenscroft Hall like the tolling of a funeral bell, and she slipped inside to find the room exactly as she had left it hours before, the fire still crackling in the massive hearth, the desk still bearing its scattered papers, and there upon the polished mahogany surface sat a crystal decanter of deep red wine beside a single glass that Frederick had clearly set out before the ball began, waiting for this moment of solitary remembrance he had described to her during their dance. Her hands shook as she crossed the Persian carpet, the vial burning against her palm through the silk of her glove, and she told herself she had come only to confront him, only to demand answers, only to look into his eyes and speak her father's name and watch for guilt or innocence in his response. But the glass sat there, gleaming in the firelight, like an accusation and a temptation all at once, and 5 years of grief and rage rose up in her throat like bile as she remembered her father's wasted face behind prison bars, his voice cracked and broken as he swore his innocence to a daughter who could do nothing to save him. She did not consciously decide to remove the vial from her glove, did not remember unstoppering it or tilting its contents into the wine that swirled darkly in the crystal glass. But suddenly it was done, and the empty vessel slipped from her fingers to shatter silently on the thick carpet as horror crashed over her in waves, because she knew now, knew with terrible certainty from the letters and Lady Harriet's words, and the gentle warmth in Frederick's eyes when he looked at her, that the man she had just condemned to death was likely innocent of the crimes she had spent half a decade preparing to punish. The sound of footsteps in the corridor turned her blood to ice, and she spun toward the door as it opened to reveal Frederick himself, his cravat loosened and his dark hair slightly disheveled from the long evening, the weariness in his handsome face transforming to surprise, and then something warmer as he found her standing beside his desk in the fire-lit sanctuary he had thought would be empty. "Miss Ashford," he said softly, closing the door behind him with a click that seemed to seal them both into this moment from which there could be no retreat. And Eleanor's gaze flew involuntarily to the poisoned glass, sitting innocent and deadly between them as the storm howled beyond the windows and the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls. And she realized with dawning terror that she had no words, no explanation, no way to undo what she had done in that moment of weakness when the ghost of her father had whispered vengeance in her ear and her treacherous hands had obeyed before her heart could countermand the order, and Frederick was already moving toward the desk with a weary smile, reaching for the glass that would kill him. Eleanor opened her mouth to scream a warning, but no sound emerged from her throat, only a strangled whisper that died before it could form words, and she watched in frozen horror as Frederick's fingers closed around the crystal stem of the wine glass, with the casual ease of a man performing a ritual he had enacted 100 times before, his dark eyes never leaving her face as he raised the poisoned vessel toward his lips, while the firelight caught the deep crimson liquid and made it glow like blood against the crystal. And she thought wildly that she should knock it from his hand, should confess everything, should throw herself at his feet and beg forgiveness for the monstrous thing she had done, but her body refused to obey her screaming mind, and she could only stand there with her heart shattering into 1,000 pieces as the man she had come to destroy, the man she now knew was innocent, the man whose gentle eyes and kind words had begun to thaw the ice around her wounded heart, lifted the glass higher and higher until it touched his lips. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as she watched him drink, watched the wine disappear in slow, measured swallows, watched his throat move as he consumed every drop of the poison she had poured, with her own treacherous hands, and tears she had not shed in 5 years suddenly burned behind her eyes, because this was not justice. This was murder. This was the destruction of the one person who had been trying to save her father's memory while she plotted his death like the villain she had become. The empty glass descended to the desk with a soft, crystalline sound that rang through the silence like a death knell, and Frederick set it down with deliberate care before lifting his gaze to meet hers. And in that moment, lightning split the sky beyond the windows and illuminated his face with terrible clarity, revealing not fear or shock or dawning horror, but something far more devastating, a calm and knowing sorrow that spoke of secrets she could not begin to fathom, and when he spoke his voice was quiet and steady and utterly without accusation. "I know," he said, and those 2 words crashed through Eleanor like a wave breaking against cliffs, shattering every assumption and expectation and desperate hope she had been clinging to, and she stared at him with her lips parted and her eyes wide and her entire world crumbling around her. Because he knew. He had known. He had drunk the poison anyway, and now he stood before her with that same gentle sadness in his eyes, while outside the storm raged, and somewhere in the corridors of this great house Lord Greville lurked with his own dark purposes, and Eleanor Ashworth, who had spent 5 years becoming an instrument of vengeance, found herself drowning in the terrible mercy of a man who had chosen to die rather than condemn her. Eleanor crumpled to her knees on the Persian carpet as the empty wine-glass caught the firelight and threw mocking reflections across the walls, her composure shattering completely as she waited for Frederick to stagger, to clutch his throat, to fall as her father had fallen in that cold prison cell 5 years ago, and the words tore from her throat in a ragged confession she could no longer contain. "My name is Eleanor Ashworth," she gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked up at him from the floor, where she knelt like a supplicant before the man she had tried to murder. "And my father was James Ashworth, whom your uncle destroyed with lies and false accusations of treason. And I have spent 5 years planning to make the Ravenscroft name pay for what was taken from me. And now I have killed an innocent man, and I am no better than the monsters who ruined my family." She waited for the poison to claim him, waited for the terrible justice she no longer wanted. But Frederick remained standing before her with that same impossible calm in his dark eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that broke something deep within her chest. "I have known who you were since 3 weeks after you arrived in London as Lady Whitmore's companion," he said, crossing to kneel before her so that their eyes were level, and she could see the compassion written across his features instead of the accusation she deserved, "because I have been searching for you, Eleanor Ashworth, searching for the daughter of the man my uncle helped destroy so that I might restore what was stolen, and beg forgiveness for crimes committed in the Ravenscroft name." The words made no sense, could not penetrate the fog of terror and guilt that clouded her mind, and she shook her head in desperate confusion even as Frederick reached out to take her trembling hands in his own steady grasp. Lady Harriet suspected your purpose when she noticed you watching me with such intensity at the Pemberton ball," he continued softly. "And when she found the vial missing from your reticule tonight, while you were dancing with me, she replaced its contents with nothing more than a sleeping draught that will leave me drowsy, but very much alive." Eleanor stared at him as understanding crashed over her in waves, as the terrible weight of murder lifted from her shoulders, only to be replaced by the crushing shame of what she had attempted. And she tried to pull her hands away, but Frederick held them firmly, his thumbs tracing gentle circles against her palms as the storm howled beyond the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere in the distance a clock continued its measured marking of time that suddenly seemed full of possibility rather than dread. "You knew," she whispered, her voice cracking on the words. "You knew what I meant to do, and you drank anyway." And Frederick nodded slowly as his eyes never left hers. "I knew," he confirmed, "because I needed you to understand that I would rather die by your hand than live knowing the woman I have come to care for believed me capable of such cruelty, and because some truths can only be spoken in moments of absolute surrender." "The woman I have come to care for," Eleanor repeated numbly, the words so foreign and unexpected that they seemed to belong to a language she had never learned, and Frederick nodded as he released one of her hands to reach up and gently brush a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture so tender that it shattered something within her chest and rebuilt it in the same devastating moment. "I have watched you for months," he continued softly, his voice barely audible above the howling of the storm beyond the windows, "ever since I first glimpsed you at the Thornwood Musicale in September, and felt certain I was looking at James Ashworth's daughter, the woman I had been seeking for 3 years, so that I might restore her birthright and clear her father's name." Eleanor shook her head in bewildered denial, unable to reconcile this reality with the narrative she had constructed. The story of a villainous duke who had inherited his uncle's cruelty along with his title and his wealth. And Frederick seemed to understand her confusion because he continued speaking in that same measured tone, painting a picture of discovery and determination that slowly replaced the portrait of evil she had carried in her heart. He told her of finding his uncle's private journals after the old duke's death, of reading with mounting horror the detailed accounts of how Lord Greville had brought fabricated evidence of treason and how the two men had conspired to destroy James Ashworth for refusing to sell his lands at a fraction of their value, lands that bordered the Ravenscroft estate and contained a river access the old duke coveted. He spoke of the sleepless nights that followed, of his determination to find the Ashworth heir and restore everything that had been stolen, of the letters he had written to Sir Benjamin Chalfont, begging assistance in building a case against Lord Greville that would stand in any court of law. And as Frederick spoke, kneeling before her on the carpet while the fire crackled and the storm raged, and somewhere in the corridor beyond Lord Greville listened with growing alarm, Eleanor felt the hatred that had sustained her for 5 years begin to crumble like ash, leaving behind only grief and regret and the terrifying vulnerability of hope. "You could have exposed me," she whispered when he fell silent. "You could have had me arrested. You could have let me poison you with actual venom and claimed justice." And Frederick shook his head slowly as his dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I could never harm the daughter of a man who died because my family failed to protect the innocent," he replied. "And I could never condemn a woman whose courage and determination I have come to admire beyond measure, even when that determination was aimed at my own destruction, because I understood from the first moment I recognized you that your vengeance was born not from cruelty, but from love, and love deserves mercy even when it wears the mask of hate." The library door burst open with a crash that shattered the intimate stillness of their confession, and Lord Greville stood framed in the doorway with wild eyes and a pistol gleaming in his trembling hand, his face contorted with the desperate fury of a man who had heard enough through the thick oak panels to know that his carefully constructed world of lies was crumbling around him like the snow that swirled past the windows behind Eleanor and Frederick. "You fool!" Greville snarled at Frederick as he advanced into the room with the weapon raised. "You sentimental fool! I should have known you would ruin everything your uncle and I built when you started digging through his papers like a grave robber seeking bones, and now you kneel on the floor with the Ashworth girl like some lovesick poet, while the evidence of my involvement sits on your desk for any magistrate to read." Eleanor felt Frederick's grip tighten on her hands as he rose slowly to his feet, positioning himself between her and the gleaming barrel of the pistol, his body a shield she did not deserve after what she had attempted, and she tried to pull him back, but he stood immovable as stone, while his voice emerged steady and cold, in a way she had not yet heard from him. "The evidence has already been copied and sent to Sir Benjamin Chalfont," Frederick said with quiet authority that seemed to fill the room despite the storm raging beyond the walls. "And even if you shoot me here tonight, the truth will reach London within the week. So I suggest you lower that weapon and accept that your sins have finally caught you, Thomas." Greville laughed, a harsh and broken sound that held no humor, only the jagged edges of a man watching his destruction approach with inevitable certainty, and the pistol wavered in his grip, as sweat beaded on his brow despite the chill that crept through the library's ancient stones. "You think I care about afterwards?" he spat, his eyes darting between Frederick and Eleanor with venomous hatred. "You think I will simply walk to the gallows while the Ashworth name is restored and the Ravenscroft fortune funds her return to society? No. If I am to hang, then I will at least have the satisfaction of taking you both with me to hell." The pistol steadied, aimed directly at Frederick's heart, and Eleanor moved without conscious thought, rising from the floor and stepping around Frederick's protective stance to face Greville directly. Her fear transformed into something harder and brighter as she met the eyes of the man who had truly destroyed her father. "Then shoot me first," she said, her voice clear and unwavering in the firelit darkness. "Shoot the daughter of James Ashworth and prove to everyone what manner of coward you truly are, because I have spent 5 years believing I hated the wrong man, and I will not allow another innocent Ravenscroft to die for your crimes." The pistol trembled, Greville's resolve cracking as he faced not a cowering victim, but a woman ablaze with righteous fury. And in that moment of hesitation, Lady Harriet appeared in the doorway behind him with Mrs. Pennington and 2 footmen, and the weapon clattered to the floor as Greville crumpled beneath the weight of his own unraveling schemes. The aftermath unfolded with the strange, dreamlike quality that descends upon moments too significant for ordinary time to contain, and Eleanor stood trembling in the centre of the library as the footman bound Lord Greville's wrists with cord, produced by the ever-prepared Mrs. Pennington, while Lady Harriet spoke in rapid, urgent tones about summoning Sir Benjamin Chalfont at first light, regardless of the snow that continued to fall in heavy curtains beyond the frost-etched windows. Frederick had not moved from Eleanor's side since Greville's collapse, his hand resting at the small of her back with a possessive gentleness that she could not yet comprehend, given everything she had done, everything she had intended. And when she turned to look at him with eyes still bright with unshed tears, she found him watching her with an expression that stole what remained of her breath. "You saved my life," he said quietly. The words meant only for her, despite the chaos surrounding them. "You stepped between me and a loaded pistol without hesitation," and Eleanor shook her head because she could not accept gratitude when guilt still burned like coals in her chest. "I tried to kill you," she whispered back, her voice cracking on the confession though he already knew it. I came here tonight with murder in my heart and poison in my glove, and you speak to me of saving when I am the one who should be bound and taken to the magistrate." Frederick's hand rose to cup her face with devastating tenderness, tilting her chin until she had no choice but to meet his gaze, and in the flickering firelight, his dark eyes held no condemnation, no disgust, only a profound understanding that she felt she had done nothing to deserve. "You came here tonight as a daughter seeking justice for a father who was stolen from her by evil men," he replied with quiet conviction. "You came here believing what any reasonable person would believe given the evidence available to you, that the current Duke of Ravenscroft was as guilty as the last one, and when you discovered the truth, you chose mercy over vengeance, even before you knew the poison had been replaced." Lady Harriet approached them as the footman escorted a defeated and silent Greville from the library, her face soft with compassion as she reached out to take Eleanor's cold hands in her warm ones. "I suspected from your first day in society that you were the Ashworth heir we had been seeking," she explained gently. "Something in your bearing, in the way you watched my cousin with such intensity, and when I found the vial in your reticule while you danced with Frederick, I knew I could not allow grief to destroy two people who deserved happiness rather than tragedy." "The vial," Eleanor breathed, understanding finally dawning. "You replaced the poison with something harmless." "Merely wine," Harriet confirmed with a slight smile, "the same vintage Frederick drinks every Christmas Eve," and Eleanor felt her knees buckle as the weight of what might have been crashed over her, but Frederick's arms were there to catch her, strong and steady and real, holding her upright as the first bells of Christmas morning began to chime somewhere deep within the ancient stones of Ravenscroft Hall. The hours that followed Greville's capture passed in a blur of activity that Eleanor observed as though watching from a great distance, her mind struggling to reconcile the woman she had been when she entered Ravenscroft Hall with the woman who now sat wrapped in a borrowed shawl before the library fire while servants moved efficiently around her and Lady Harriet pressed cups of warm tea into her trembling hands. Frederick had been called away to deal with the immediate practicalities of securing Greville in a locked chamber until Sir Benjamin could arrive, but his eyes had found Eleanor's across the room before he left, and in that single glance she had read a promise that their conversation was far from finished, that the words spoken between them in those desperate midnight moments were only the beginning of something neither of them yet fully understood. The snow continued to fall beyond the windows as Christmas morning crept slowly toward dawn, and Eleanor found herself thinking of all the Christmas mornings she had spent alone since her father's death, the hollow celebrations in cold, rented rooms where she had nursed her hatred like a flame against the darkness, and how different this morning felt despite the chaos and exhaustion that weighted her limbs. Lady Harriet settled into the chair beside her with a soft rustle of silk, her face showing the strain of the night's events, but her eyes warm with something that looked remarkably like affection as she studied Eleanor's pale features in the firelight. "You know," she said quietly, "Frederick has spoken of little else but finding you for the past 3 years. And when I say you, I mean the Ashworth heir, the daughter of the man his uncle destroyed. And I confess, I wondered if he would ever locate you, or if you had perhaps left England entirely to escape the shadow of your father's disgrace." Eleanor's throat tightened at the mention of her father, at the casual acknowledgement of the disgrace that had defined her existence for so long, but there was no judgment in Harriet's voice, only gentle understanding, and perhaps a hint of admiration. "He had investigators searching," Harriet continued. "He pored through his uncle's papers for any clue to where you might have gone, and all along you were hiding in plain sight, transforming yourself into Miss Ellen Ashford and positioning yourself to strike at the heart of the very man who was trying to save you." The irony was not lost on Eleanor, and she felt a sound escape her that was half laugh and half sob, the release of tension that had built over 5 long years finally finding its way out through the cracks in her carefully constructed armor. "I was so certain," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "I was so certain that he was guilty, that the Ravenscroft name was synonymous with everything that had been taken from me. And I never once considered that a man might inherit a title without inheriting the sins of his predecessor." Harriet reached out to take her hand, squeezing gently, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, the first tentative unfurling of hope she had allowed herself to feel since the night the soldiers had come for her father, and her world had shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The dawn of Christmas morning broke pale and silver through the library windows as Frederick finally returned to Eleanor's side, and she saw in his face the weariness of a man who had spent hours managing crisis, but also something else, something warm and wondering that made her heart stutter in her chest despite everything that had transpired between them in the dark hours of the night. He dismissed the servants with a quiet word and closed the library door behind him, and then they were alone again in the room where her world had shattered and reformed itself into something she could not yet fully comprehend, and Eleanor found she could not meet his eyes for fear of what she might find there, now that the immediate danger had passed, and there was time for him to reconsider his extraordinary mercy. Frederick crossed the room with deliberate steps and knelt before her chair, taking her cold hands in his warm ones, and the gesture was so unexpected, so impossibly tender from a duke to the woman who had tried to murder him mere hours ago, that Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks before she could stop them. "You have every right to hate me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire that Mrs. Pennington had kept burning through the long night. "You have every right to call Sir Benjamin and have me arrested alongside Greville, and I would not blame you. I would go willingly, because whatever punishment awaits me cannot be worse than the knowledge of what I nearly did to an innocent man." Frederick's hands tightened on hers, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion that surprised her with its intensity. "I have spent 3 years carrying the guilt of my uncle's sins," he said. 3 years searching for you so that I might restore what was stolen from your family. And when I finally found you, it was to discover that the same pain that drove my quest had driven you to the edge of an act that would have destroyed us both. And Eleanor, I cannot find it in my heart to condemn you for a grief I understand so intimately." She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not the monster she had constructed in her imagination over 5 years of hatred, but a man who bore his own burdens with quiet dignity, a man who had chosen to see her suffering rather than her sin, and something cracked open inside her that she had kept sealed since the night her father was dragged away in chains. "The documents are prepared," Frederick continued, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her wrist in a touch that scattered her thoughts like startled birds. "Sir Benjamin will witness them when he arrives. Your father's name will be cleared, your family's estate restored, and Greville will face justice for the crimes he committed alongside my uncle all those years ago." Eleanor shook her head in bewilderment, unable to process the magnitude of what he was offering her after everything she had done. And Frederick smiled then, a real smile that transformed his solemn features and made her breath catch with the beauty of it. "This is not charity," he said softly. "This is justice long delayed. And it is my Christmas gift to you, Eleanor Ashworth, the restoration of everything that should never have been taken." The hours that followed stretched soft and strange as the first true light of Christmas morning began to paint the snow-covered world beyond the windows in shades of rose and gold. And Eleanor found herself standing at the library window, watching the transformation, while Frederick spoke quietly with Sir Benjamin in the corridor outside, their voices a low murmur that occasionally rose with emphasis before settling again into the measured tones of men discussing matters of law and justice. She had not slept, could not imagine sleeping when her entire understanding of her life had been dismantled and rebuilt in the space of a single night, and yet she did not feel exhausted, so much as emptied out, hollowed like a vessel that had contained nothing but poison for 5 long years, and now stood clean and waiting to be filled with something new. The cameo at her throat felt different now, no longer the talisman of vengeance she had worn against her skin as a constant reminder of what she had lost, but simply her mother's jewel, a connection to a woman who had loved her, and would have wept to see the creature her daughter had become in the years since her death. Eleanor traced the carved profile with trembling fingers, and wondered what her mother would think of Frederick, of this impossible man who had drunk what he believed to be poison rather than condemn the woman who had tried to murder him. And she felt certain, with a conviction that surprised her, that her mother would have approved, would have recognized in him the same qualities of honor and compassion that had defined her father before the accusations had destroyed him. The door opened behind her, and she turned to find Frederick entering alone, Sir Benjamin having departed to oversee the formal arrest of Lord Greville, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the room where everything had changed, the distance between them charged with all that had been spoken and all that remained unsaid. "You should rest," Frederick said softly. But he made no move toward the door, and Eleanor understood that the words were an offering she was free to refuse, a choice he was placing in her hands, as he had placed so many choices this night. "I find I cannot," she admitted, her voice still rough from tears and confession. "I find that when I close my eyes, I see you drinking from that cup, and I do not know how to forgive myself for what I nearly did to you, for the hatred I carried so close to my heart that it nearly destroyed the one person who was trying to save me." Frederick crossed the room then with the same deliberate grace she had observed at the ball, only now she understood that his movements were those of a man who had learned caution through painful experience, a man who approached wounded creatures with patience rather than force. He stopped an arm's length away from her, close enough that she could see the fatigue shadowing his eyes and the faint lines around his mouth that spoke of strain, but also the warmth that had not dimmed despite everything she had done. And Eleanor felt her heart turn over in her chest with an emotion she was not yet ready to name. "You have already forgiven me more than I deserve," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper as the morning light caught the tears still drying on her cheeks and turned them to silver. "And I do not understand how you can look at me without revulsion, how you can stand so close to the woman who would have watched you die and felt nothing but satisfaction if I had not discovered the truth in time." Frederick reached out then, slowly giving her every opportunity to pull away, and when she did not, he cupped her face in his hands with a tenderness that made her breath catch and her heart pound against her ribs like a caged thing desperate for freedom. "Because I see you," he said, and his voice held a roughness that spoke of sleepless hours and emotions held too long in check. "I see the girl who lost everything and survived, the woman who carried her pain alone for 5 years with no one to share the burden. And I see the courage it took to stay your hand when you could have completed your mission and disappeared before anyone knew the truth." Eleanor shook her head within the gentle cage of his palms, unable to accept absolution she had not earned, and yet unable to pull away from the warmth of his touch that seemed to reach through her skin and wrap around the frozen places inside her that had known nothing but cold hatred for so long. "I did not stay my hand," she reminded him, her voice cracking on the words. "I poured the poison even after I suspected you were innocent, Even after the dance and Harriet's warnings and everything I read in your letters, I still committed the act because some part of me could not release the hatred I had carried for so long. And that is not courage. That is weakness of the worst kind." Frederick's thumbs traced gentle arcs across her cheekbones, wiping away fresh tears that fell despite her efforts to contain them, and his expression held no judgment, no condemnation, only a profound understanding that made her feel seen in ways she had never experienced before this impossible night. "The poison never touched the wine," he reminded her gently. "Harriet replaced it with a sleeping draught days ago because she suspected you had some desperate purpose, and so your moment of weakness harmed no one, but your choice to confess everything when you believed I was dying. That choice revealed your true heart, Eleanor, a heart that could not watch an innocent man die, even for the sake of vengeance you believed was righteous." The revelation still stunned her, the knowledge that she had never truly been in danger of committing murder, that even her darkest moment had been witnessed and quietly prevented by people who barely knew her but chose mercy over suspicion. Frederick lowered his hands from her face but did not step back, and the space between them felt charged with possibility, with the fragile beginnings of something neither of them had expected to find in the wreckage of this extraordinary night. "I have spent 3 years searching for you," he said softly, "and now that I have found you, I find I cannot bear the thought of letting you disappear again into a world that has shown you nothing but cruelty." Eleanor felt the words settle into her chest like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples through the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart over 5 long years of solitude and purpose, and she found she could not speak, could not find the language to express the tumult of emotions that warred within her, as Frederick stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the chill that had crept into the library as the fire burned low. The morning light continued its slow transformation of the room, painting everything in shades of gold and rose that seemed too beautiful, too hopeful for the gravity of what had passed between them, and Eleanor became acutely aware of how she must appear after a sleepless night of confession and tears. Her dove-grey gown creased from hours of sitting and standing and pacing, her hair escaping its pins in tendrils that framed her face like the remnants of a storm. "I cannot stay," she whispered, though the words felt like knives in her throat. "I have nothing, I am nothing. The companion I pretended to be never existed, and Eleanor Ashworth is the daughter of a man who died disgraced. Even if that disgrace was manufactured by your uncle and Lord Greville, the stain of it still clings to me, and I will not have you dragged down by association with a woman who entered your home planning murder." Frederick's expression shifted then, something flickering in his eyes that she could not quite name, something that looked almost like pain mingled with a determination that she was beginning to recognize as fundamental to his character. And when he spoke, his voice held a roughness that made her pulse quicken, despite everything. "Do you think I care about stains?" he asked quietly. "I have spent 3 years carrying the weight of my uncle's sins, watching society smile at me, while knowing that behind closed doors they whisper about the cruelties he committed, the lives he destroyed for profit and spite. And I have learned that reputation is a fragile thing built on sand, while character is bedrock. And Eleanor, your character has been forged in a fire that would have destroyed lesser souls." She shook her head, unwilling to accept praise she did not deserve, but Frederick continued before she could voice her protest. "I am not asking you for answers today," he said, and his voice gentled in a way that made her eyes sting with fresh tears. "I am not asking you for promises or declarations. I am simply asking you to stay, to let me restore what was taken from your family, to let me give you back your name and your father's honor. And then, when you are Eleanor Ashworth again, with all the world knowing the truth of what was done to you, then perhaps you might consider whether there could be something more between us than the strange, twisted fate that brought you to my door with poison in your glove." The offer hung between them like a gift she did not know how to accept, and Eleanor felt the last of her resistance crumbling as the Christmas morning sun spilled fully into the library and illuminated the face of the man who had chosen to trust her with his life. The door to the library opened without warning, and Lady Harriet entered with Sir Benjamin Chalfont close behind her, both of them bearing expressions that spoke of urgent purpose and carefully contained excitement. And Eleanor felt Frederick's hand find hers, and hold it firmly, as if anchoring them both against whatever tide was about to sweep through the room that had already witnessed so much transformation in the span of a single night. "I apologize for the intrusion," Harriet said, her eyes moving between their joined hands and their faces with an approval she did not bother to conceal. "But Benjamin has brought news that cannot wait, news that changes everything and must be shared before Greville has any opportunity to escape or destroy what remains of his carefully constructed web of lies." Sir Benjamin stepped forward, a sheaf of papers clutched in his hands, and Eleanor recognized the worn leather case they had come from as the same one Frederick had shown her hours ago when he first revealed the depth of his investigation into her father's destruction. "We have found the final piece," Sir Benjamin announced, and his voice carried the gravity of a man who understood that words could rebuild what other words had torn asunder. A letter in the old Duke's own hand that explicitly names Greville as the architect of the false evidence against Lord Ashworth, describing in detail how they manufactured the treason charges to seize the Ashworth shipping interests and eliminate a business rival who had discovered their smuggling operations. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, and only Frederick's arm sliding around her waist kept her upright, as the magnitude of Sir Benjamin's words crashed over her like waves against a cliff, eroding 5 years of isolation and shame, with the simple truth that her father had been exactly what she had always believed him to be, an innocent man destroyed by monsters wearing the masks of gentlemen. "There is more," Sir Benjamin continued, his eyes meeting Eleanor's with a compassion that made fresh tears spill down her cheeks. "The letter also contains instructions for what should be done with the Ashworth properties and accounts, which were never legally seized since the conviction was achieved through perjured testimony. And as the sole surviving heir, Miss Ashworth, you are entitled to full restoration of your family's estate, lands, and fortune, all of which have been held in trust by the Crown pending resolution of the case." Frederick's arm tightened around her, and she felt his lips brush against her temple in a gesture so tender and so natural that it seemed they had known each other for years rather than hours, and when she looked up at him, she saw her own overwhelming emotion reflected in his eyes, a joy so profound it was almost indistinguishable from grief. "Your father's name will be cleared publicly," Frederick said softly. "Every newspaper will carry the story of his innocence, and society will know that Eleanor Ashworth is the daughter of a hero who was murdered by the very men who should have protected him." The weight of revelation settled over the library like a benediction as Eleanor struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what Sir Benjamin's words meant for her future, for the memory of her father, for everything she had believed about herself, and her place in a world that had cast her out with such casual cruelty. And she found herself turning in Frederick's arms to face him fully, searching his features for any sign that this was merely another dream from which she would wake to find herself still trapped in the grey half-life of a companion with no name and no hope. "You knew," she whispered, her voice catching on the words, as understanding dawned with the brilliance of the Christmas morning sun, now fully illuminating the room where she had once planned to commit murder. "You knew who I was, and you searched for the evidence that would free my father's name even before I came here with poison in my glove. And I repaid your kindness with treachery that would have ended your life if Lady Harriet had not intervened." Frederick's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that continued to fall despite her best efforts to contain them. And when he spoke, his voice held a tenderness that made her heart ache with the weight of emotions she had denied herself for so long. "I knew who you were the moment I saw you at Lady Pemberton's musical 3 months ago," he said softly. "I had commissioned a portrait of your family from the miniature your father once gave my uncle as a gift before their falling out, and I would have known those eyes anywhere, Eleanor, eyes that held such sorrow and such fierce determination that I understood immediately you had come seeking justice or revenge, and I could not bring myself to blame you for either." Lady Harriet stepped forward then, her expression warm with approval and something that looked remarkably like maternal affection, as she addressed Eleanor directly for the first time since entering the room. "I suspected from the moment Frederick told me about the mysterious Miss Ashford who had captured his attention," she said gently. "And when I saw you slip away toward the library last night, I followed at a distance and watched you pour something into his wine glass. And I knew then that my suspicions were correct, so I simply waited until you left and replaced the contents with harmless water before Frederick arrived for his midnight vigil." The revelation that she had never truly endangered Frederick's life should have brought Eleanor relief, and it did. But beneath that relief lay a deeper gratitude, that these people who owed her nothing had chosen to protect not only Frederick, but Eleanor herself from the consequences of an act committed in grief and desperation. Sir Benjamin cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the papers in his hands and the practical matters that remained to be addressed, despite the emotional storm that had swept through all of them. "There is the matter of Lord Greville," he said, his tone shifting to one of professional gravity. "He remains in this house unaware that his crimes have been discovered, and we must decide how to proceed before he has any opportunity to flee or destroy additional evidence that might implicate him in other schemes beyond the destruction of the Ashworth family."